On the morning of January 17, 1966, high above the coast of southeastern Spain, a routine Cold War operation turned into one of the most dangerous nuclear accidents in human history, an event so severe that for months the world came within a whisper of discovering that the United States had lost a fully armed hydrogen bomb in the Mediterranean Sea, a bomb with the power to kill millions if it ever detonated. And yet, the most terrifying part was not simply the accident itself, but how the United States scrambled to keep the truth hidden while scrambling through the ocean depths in a desperate race against time, against the Soviet Union, and against the unimaginable consequences of failure. At 10:22 a.m., a U.S. Air Force B-52 Stratofortress bomber approached a KC-135 tanker for mid-air refueling, a standard procedure that was being performed dozens of times a day across Europe as part of Operation Chrome Dome, America's airborne nuclear alert strategy designed to keep hydrogen bombs constantly in the sky so that they could be launched against the Soviet Union, even if U.S. bases were destroyed in a surprise attack. But on this morning, something went wrong, catastrophically wrong. As the bomber approached the tanker at more than 500 miles per hour, the two aircraft collided, instantly igniting thousands of gallons of jet fuel and turning the sky above the small fishing village of Palomares into a giant fireball. The explosion tore both aircraft apart, killing all 4 KC-135 crew members and scattering wreckage across miles of coastline. The B-52 crew ejected, some surviving, some not. But what mattered most to Washington was not the bomber, not the tanker, and not even the lives lost in the explosion. What mattered were the 4 hydrogen bombs the B-52 was carrying. Each bomb was a B-28Fi thermonuclear device, roughly 1.45 megatons, more than 100 times the power of the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When the bomber broke apart, the bombs dropped toward the earth. 2 slammed into the Spanish countryside with such force that their conventional explosives detonated, scattering plutonium dust across farms, homes, and fields. 1 bomb landed intact in a dry riverbed. But the 4th bomb, the most important one, was simply gone. It had fallen into the Mediterranean Sea, and no one, not the U.S. Air Force, not the Spanish government, not even the fishermen who saw parachutes falling from the sky, had any idea where it was. Within hours, the Pentagon realized the scale of the disaster. 3 nuclear bombs had been recovered on land, but 1 hydrogen bomb was missing somewhere in the ocean. It was the nightmare scenario nuclear planners had feared since the dawn of the atomic age. A live thermonuclear weapon lying somewhere underwater, vulnerable to corrosion, to impact, and worst of all, to foreign recovery. If the Soviet Union found it first, the consequences would be incalculable. They could reverse engineer American nuclear designs, expose U.S. operational failures, or use the discovery as global propaganda proving that the United States was too irresponsible to hold nuclear weapons. President Lyndon Johnson was briefed immediately, and orders were passed down with terrifying clarity. Find the bomb at all costs, retrieve it before the Soviets even learn it is missing, and ensure the world never discovers how close this incident came to nuclear catastrophe. Meanwhile, in Palomares, Spanish civilians had no idea what had fallen from the sky. Farmers walked into their fields to find huge craters, debris, and strange metallic fragments scattered everywhere. Local police believed at first that a commercial aircraft had crashed. Some villagers even picked up glowing plutonium-contaminated fragments, unaware that they were touching radioactive material that would remain deadly for tens of thousands of years. Spanish leader Francisco Franco, one of America's reluctant Cold War allies, was furious when U.S. officials finally admitted privately that nuclear weapons had been dropped on Spanish soil. Publicly, however, the incident had to be minimized. Spain allowed U.S. bases on its territory in exchange for financial and military support, but the regime already faced internal unrest and international criticism. A nuclear accident could destabilize everything. As the Spanish government struggled to prevent panic, the United States launched the largest nuclear recovery mission in its history. Navy ships, submarines, submersibles, helicopters, divers, and deep-sea experts were rushed to the area. Hundreds of personnel were mobilized. The U.S. Sixth Fleet moved into position. Every single hour mattered. The Mediterranean was vast, the currents unpredictable, and the missing bomb, if it had sunk deep enough, could be lying thousands of feet below the surface where human divers could never reach it. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, almost certainly intercepted signals and began monitoring the situation. American intelligence feared that Soviet spy trawlers, or submarines, might attempt to slip into the area disguised as fishing vessels. If they recovered the bomb first, it would constitute one of the greatest intelligence coups of the Cold War. To prevent that, the United States established an offshore exclusion zone, using naval vessels to block any unauthorized ship from approaching the suspected search area. But there was a bigger problem. No one knew where to look. The Air Force had a rough idea of the bomber's flight path, but the exact location where the bomb fell into the water could not be tracked. The parachute attached to the bomb may have carried it for miles before impact. Worse, ocean currents in the area were strong and unpredictable, meaning that even if the bomb did not sink instantly, it could have drifted underwater before settling on the seabed. The world saw only a small portion of what was happening. News outlets reported a U.S. plane crash in Spain. Only weeks later did foreign journalists uncover hints that nuclear weapons were involved, forcing the Pentagon to confirm that an incident had occurred, but insisting that there was no danger. Privately, Washington knew there was extreme danger. The bombs had been designed with multiple safeguards to prevent accidental detonation, but those safeguards were not perfect. The two bombs that detonated their conventional charges had spread radioactive contamination across hundreds of acres of Spanish farmland. The U.S. military quickly began scraping tons of plutonium-contaminated soil into barrels and shipping them to America for disposal. But nothing frightened the Pentagon more than the missing fourth bomb, because if it exploded underwater or fell into Soviet hands, the consequences would be global and irreversible. The U.S. Navy brought in one of the most advanced deep-sea recovery vehicles of the era, the Alvin submersible, famous for its later exploration of the Titanic wreck. The search also deployed innovative sonar systems, underwater cameras, and magnetometers capable of detecting metal on the seabed. But days passed, then weeks, then months, and still the bomb could not be found. Washington grew desperate. Franco grew impatient, and the people of Palomares began demanding answers as American soldiers in hazmat suits tore up their farmland. Everything now depended on a handful of Navy engineers, deep-sea pilots, and intelligence analysts who had to find a single bomb in the Mediterranean before the world learned that the United States had lost a weapon capable of wiping out an entire nation. And then, in early March, after nearly 2 months of searching, an unexpected breakthrough came from the most unlikely source imaginable: a Spanish fisherman in a small wooden boat. The breakthrough that American search teams had been praying for came not from the Pentagon, not from the U.S. Navy, and not from the advanced submersibles combing the seafloor, but from a humble Spanish fisherman named Francisco Simón Orts, known locally as Paco el de la Bomba. who walked into the U.S. Naval Command tent claiming he had seen a parachute falling into the sea on the morning of the crash, an account the Americans initially dismissed as yet another villager trying to get attention, until Paco insisted he could pinpoint the location and would take them there himself, a claim that sounded impossible yet became the key that unlocked the entire hunt for the missing hydrogen bomb. Paco explained that while he was out on his fishing boat the day of the crash, he saw something falling slowly toward the ocean, suspended beneath a white parachute, drifting with the wind before dropping into a particular patch of water just off the coast. He marked the location in his mind using 3 prominent landmarks on shore, a common technique among fishermen, and he was confident he could return to the exact point even weeks later. American officers were skeptical. The Mediterranean was enormous, and the bomb could have sunk thousands of feet beneath the surface. But after weeks of failure and mounting pressure from Washington, they decided to take the fishermen out to sea. To the surprise of the U.S. Navy, Paco did not hesitate or struggle to orient himself. He stood on the deck, scanning the coastline, adjusting their position, and then said simply, "Aquí," here. The U.S. Navy immediately deployed sonar and underwater search equipment in the area, and within days, searchers detected a large metallic object on the seafloor, lying more than 2,500 feet underwater. When the first grainy images from underwater cameras came back, every commander in the room froze. There it was, the missing hydrogen bomb, lying on its side on the sandy ocean bottom, still intact, its parachute caught on underwater rocks, its casing slightly damaged, but the nuclear components seemingly undisturbed. This confirmation should have been the end of the crisis, but instead, it marked the beginning of an even more difficult phase. Recovering the bomb would prove far more dangerous and complicated than finding it. The ocean depth in that area was near the limit of what U.S. submersibles could handle. The Alvin submersible, piloted by a 3-man crew, attempted to reach the bomb and attach lifting cables, but strong currents, poor visibility, and the risk of damaging the bomb made every approach potentially deadly. On one dive, the Alvin crew saw firsthand how precariously the bomb rested. It was wedged in an underwater canyon, meaning that any disturbance could send it tumbling deeper into the abyss, where recovery would become nearly impossible. The United States brought in another vehicle, Curve Y, a robotic deep-sea submersible controlled via cable from the surface. Curve Y was slow, primitive by modern standards, and incredibly difficult to maneuver, but it was the best tool available. On the first attempts, the robot could not attach the lifting hooks. On another attempt, Curve Y became tangled in the bomb's parachute cords, and for a terrifying moment, operators thought they might lose the robot, and worse, accidentally trigger movement of the bomb itself. The weather worsened. Waves battered the recovery ships. Divers could not descend at that depth, meaning everything depended on a robotic system that barely had the precision required. Meanwhile, American intelligence grew increasingly paranoid that the Soviets might attempt to intervene. A Soviet fishing trawler, almost certainly a disguised intelligence gathering vessel, began circling the area, watching the operation. U.S. Navy destroyers attempted to block its approach, but the presence of the vessel confirmed what Washington feared. The Soviets knew a nuclear weapon was missing, and they would not pass up the opportunity to observe or even interfere in its recovery. Over the next several days, the recovery mission survived near disasters. A lifting line snapped under the weight. A cable malfunctioned and nearly dropped Curve Y onto the bomb itself. One attempt actually ended with the bomb being lifted, partway to the surface, before slipping free and crashing back to the ocean floor, prompting panic in the command center as officers feared the fall might have damaged the bomb's internal mechanisms. The Navy ordered round-the-clock operations, rotating crews to maintain the effort without interruption. Pressure from the White House grew overwhelming. President Johnson wanted daily briefings. The Spanish government wanted the bomb removed before journalists uncovered the truth. And the people of Palomares wanted to know why American soldiers continued tearing up their fields and sending contaminated soil across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, the bomb continued to sit in the depths, like a sleeping monster waiting for someone to disturb it. Finally, in early April 1966, nearly 3 months after the bomb fell from the sky, Curvy Wise succeeded in threading a cable through the parachute shrouds and securing the weapon for lifting. Slowly, painfully, carefully, the bomb rose toward the surface, inch by inch. When it finally broke through the waves, sailors on the deck of the USS Petrel erupted in relief, though no one dared approach it until nuclear safety personnel confirmed it was stable. Photographs from that day show sailors crowded around the bomb, visibly exhausted, staring at a weapon that could have killed millions. The crisis was over, but the political fallout was just beginning. The United States immediately launched a full-scale public relations campaign to reassure Spain, NATO, and the world that everything was under control, that hydrogen bombs were perfectly safe, and that the contamination in Palomares posed no danger. To demonstrate this, U.S. Ambassador Angier Duque staged a publicity stunt in which he and Spanish officials swam at the beach in front of cameras, insisting the water was safe. Even though U.S. scientists privately warned that radioactive particles had washed into the sea, Spanish families living near the impact sites were far less convinced. Many demanded compensation for contaminated crops, livestock, and land. American soldiers had harvested more than 1,400 tons of radioactive soil and shipped it to a U.S. nuclear disposal site in South Carolina. Even then, the U.S. could not remove all the plutonium. Much of it remained scattered across farmland, buried in the dirt, or absorbed into plants. Decades later, Spanish scientists would still detect elevated radiation levels in the region. Some areas remain fenced off even today. The Palomares Incident also forced the United States to confront an uncomfortable truth. Operation Chrome Dome, the airborne nuclear alert system responsible for the crash, had pushed the military far beyond safe operational limits. B-52 bombers had crashed multiple times during refueling maneuvers. Crews were fatigued, procedures were rushed, and hydrogen bombs had already been lost or damaged in other incidents that the public never learned about. In the aftermath of Palomares, the U.S. quietly scaled back Chrome Dome flights, reducing the risk of mid-air nuclear disasters. But the true lesson of the incident went far deeper. It revealed how vulnerable the world was to nuclear catastrophe, not through war, not through malice, but through human error, miscommunication, and the inherent danger of maintaining thousands of nuclear weapons in constant motion. It also showed how secrecy shaped the Cold War. For months, the world had no idea that a single accident could have destroyed an entire region, poisoned thousands, or handed the Soviets priceless nuclear intelligence. Even after the bomb was recovered, much of the truth remained classified for decades. The United States worked hard to keep images of the damaged bombs hidden, to downplay the contamination, and to minimize the operational failures that allowed the crash to happen in the first place. And yet, for all their secrecy, one fact could not be erased. The world had been lucky, extraordinarily lucky. If the bomb on land had detonated its nuclear core instead of only its conventional explosive, if the underwater bomb had slipped deeper into the ocean, if a Soviet vessel had reached it first, or if Paco the fisherman had not come forward, the Palomares Incident could have become the worst nuclear disaster in human history. Instead, it became a forgotten chapter of the Cold War, a story overshadowed by larger crises, but no less terrifying in its implications. And beneath the surface, both literally and metaphorically, the radioactive scars of that day remain. In the weeks following the recovery of the bomb, the U.S. government moved swiftly to transform the Palomares Incident from the greatest nuclear near-disaster of the Cold War into a carefully controlled narrative of competence, success, and calm professionalism. Even though behind the scenes the accident had exposed catastrophic weaknesses in America's nuclear safety protocols, NATO's crisis management systems, and the very logic of maintaining airborne nuclear patrols over allied nations, all of which Washington hoped the world would never learn. The Spanish government, eager to avoid embarrassing revelations and fearful that public outrage could destabilize Franco's fragile dictatorship, cooperated fully in the cover-up, agreeing to restrict press access, limit interviews with villagers, and allow the U.S. military to take control of the contaminated zones near Palomares. But while officials in Madrid and Washington were desperate to maintain a united front, the villagers whose land had been blanketed in plutonium dust were far less convinced by the official assurances that everything was safe. Farmers woke up to find American soldiers in gas masks digging up their fields, loading trucks full of radioactive soil, and carrying away their crops, livestock, and even the top layer of dirt from their gardens. Some locals reported sudden illnesses. Others noticed the military fencing off certain areas without explanation, creating no-go zones that raised more questions than answers. Radiation detection teams swept through homes, wells, and orchards, and although they reassured residents that the contamination was minimal, internal reports painted a very different picture. Whole patches of land showed plutonium readings dozens of times higher than the maximum recommended exposure threshold. Yet U.S. officials insisted that because the nuclear cores had not undergone full detonation, the environmental impact was insignificant, a statement designed more for diplomatic protection than scientific accuracy. In reality, the only reason Palomares avoided becoming an uninhabitable wasteland was sheer blind luck. The conventional high explosive inside 2 of the bombs had detonated upon impact, dispersing plutonium as dust, rather than engaging the nuclear core that would have produced a true thermonuclear blast. That luck, however, did nothing to calm the panic inside NATO. When the full details of the accident were reviewed at high-level briefings, several commanders were stunned that the U.S. had allowed such dangerous flights to continue over Allied territory without adequate safety systems. NATO officials worried that future accidents could occur in more densely populated areas. The United Kingdom, Turkey, and Italy had all hosted chrome dome refueling corridors. A similar mid-air collision over London or Rome would have plunged Europe into chaos and potentially fractured the alliance. The United States responded by quietly initiating a sweeping internal review of airborne alert operations. Reports from bomber crews revealed deep fatigue, long flights without proper rest, repeated mechanical issues, and dangerously close calls that had never been disclosed to NATO partners. Some crew members even confessed that they had begun to normalize risk, treating nuclear patrols like routine airline flights despite carrying weapons capable of annihilating cities. Nuclear safety officers warned that Chrome Dome was an accident waiting to happen, and Palomares, they argued, was simply the disaster that slipped through the cracks. Under mounting pressure, and without admitting the root cause publicly, the U.S. Air Force began scaling back Chrome Dome missions. By 1968, the program was canceled entirely, replaced with a less hazardous ground alert strategy. But while American policymakers congratulated themselves on quietly fixing the issue, the Spanish villagers who had lived through the accident received little compensation, little transparency, and little long-term support. Some of their land remained unusable. Others were warned never to dig too deeply into certain areas. Even decades later, independent researchers found plutonium hotspots left behind by incomplete cleanup efforts, hidden beneath layers of soil that had simply been pushed over contaminated ground. Meanwhile, the global press, once kept at bay, began to uncover fragments of the story, often through leaks or offhand comments by military personnel. Spanish opposition groups used the accident as evidence that Franco had allowed the country to become a dumping ground for American weapons. Anti-nuclear movements across Europe seized on Palomares as proof that nuclear armaments were inherently unstable and unpredictable. The Soviet Union, eager to exploit the embarrassment, issued statements condemning the reckless American nuclear imperialism that endangered innocent civilians. Ironically, some Soviet submarines had been spotted near the search area just days after the collision, confirming U.S. fears that Moscow had been monitoring the crisis closely. Soviet newspapers published exaggerated accounts, claiming that the United States had nearly vaporized an entire region of Spain and that the Mediterranean Sea was permanently poisoned, a distortion of the truth, but one that resonated with global audiences. Washington responded aggressively through public diplomacy, insisting that the incident had been safely resolved and that nuclear weapons remained secure. But even this effort hit a public relations disaster when the American ambassador, trying to prove that the beaches were safe, famously staged a photo op swimming in the supposedly clean water alongside a Spanish minister. The stunt backfired. Residents saw it as patronizing, and journalists derided it as a clumsy attempt to distract from the real issue: why nuclear bombs were flying above their villages in the first place. At the same time, behind closed doors, Palomares forced American scientists to rethink nuclear weapon durability. The bomb that fell into the sea had survived a crash, saltwater exposure, immense pressure, and months on the seafloor without a catastrophic failure. While this proved the robustness of U.S. nuclear design, it also highlighted a terrifying reality. If the bomb had drifted only a few miles, the Soviets could have retrieved it. Such a loss would have revealed classified engineering details, fissile material configurations, and hydrogen bomb architecture, secrets that cost billions to develop and define the balance of power. The CIA admitted privately that the only reason the Soviets had not interfered was because the U.S. recovery fleet had moved in so quickly. In later declassified documents, American intelligence analysts concluded that had the accident occurred in deeper water or farther from shore, Soviet divers or deep-sea submersibles, though less advanced, might have attempted recovery. Meanwhile, the families of the airmen who died in the collision were left with unanswered questions. Why had their loved ones been flying such dangerous missions? Why had the Air Force ignored repeated warnings about risky refueling practices? And why had the government attempted to hide the true nature of the disaster? Many widows were given only vague explanations and told simply that their husbands had died in service of national defense. Only years later did documents reveal that the collision was caused by a miscommunication between the B-52 crew and the tanker pilot, who misjudged the refueling distance. an error that would have been survivable had the aircraft not been carrying hydrogen bombs. As for the villagers of Palomares, their lives would be forever divided into before and after the explosion. Their town became a symbol of Cold War recklessness. Their farms became test sites. Their children grew up knowing their soil had once been contaminated by plutonium. Even today, those who lived through the accident recall the fear, the confusion, and the surreal sight of American soldiers descending on their quiet coastal village, digging up the earth and hauling away everything in sight. Yet for all the chaos, the Palomares incident ultimately faded from the world's memory, overshadowed by the Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam, and other Cold War flashpoints. Only historians and nuclear analysts continued to study it, recognizing what the general public did not, that the world had narrowly escaped a catastrophe of unimaginable scale. A hydrogen bomb lost at sea, 2 bombs detonating their high explosives near civilians, a recovery mission fraught with risk, and a geopolitical struggle unfolding beneath the surface. Palomares was not just an accident, but a turning point in nuclear history. It demonstrated with brutal clarity that even the most advanced superpower on Earth could lose control of its deadliest weapons. And if one accident could happen, more could follow. In the years after the incident, multiple similar Broken Arrow events would occur. Bombs lost, missiles damaged, nuclear materials misplaced, each one hidden from the public until decades later. Palomares was simply the first to be seen, the first to be photographed, the first to be lived through by men, women, and children who had no idea they were standing on ground coated with one of the most toxic substances ever created. And as the Cold War continued, the fundamental question raised by Palomares lingered quietly in the background. If the world's most sophisticated militaries could not prevent accidents with nuclear weapons, how could they ever prevent catastrophe? In the aftermath of the Palomares disaster, the U.S. government became obsessed with one overarching mission: ensuring that no future accident would ever expose American nuclear vulnerabilities to the world again. Because while the bomb had been successfully recovered and the immediate crisis had passed, the political, scientific, and psychological aftershocks of the incident rippled through every corner of the American defense establishment, revealing that the Cold War nuclear system, designed to terrify the Soviet Union into caution, was itself terrifyingly fragile, reliant on human judgment, mechanical precision, and good fortune, any of which could fail at any moment. The Pentagon held classified hearings where generals admitted, often reluctantly, that America had simply been lucky that day, that luck, not engineering, had prevented a nuclear catastrophe. They reviewed case after case of previous near misses, accidental releases, failed safety switches, bombs dropped from aircraft, missiles malfunctioning during tests. The Joint Chiefs realized, perhaps for the first time, that the very system they had sworn to uphold was built on a foundation of unpredictable human behavior and aging technology. Their confidence, once absolute, faltered. But while these internal debates intensified, the outside world remained largely unaware of the truth. The official narrative crafted for public consumption emphasized quick recovery, minimal danger, and total safety. The Air Force praised its crew. The U.S. Navy hailed Curvy 1 as a technological triumph. Journalists were fed photographs of smiling officials and calm beaches. Spain and the United States released carefully crafted joint statements that mentioned the crash, but avoided any serious discussion of its nuclear implications. Behind those polished words, however, the scientific community knew better. Nuclear physicists reviewing the aftermath were alarmed by how much plutonium had been dispersed by the conventional detonations. They found that the plutonium dust behaved unpredictably, clinging to olive trees, drifting across fields, and collecting in irrigation channels. Early radiation surveys detected contamination in places the military had never expected, raising fears that groundwater might be affected. But Washington ordered the reports classified, fearing international fallout, no pun intended. Meanwhile, Spain's leadership, eager not to jeopardize its strategic relationship with the United States, cooperated fully with American efforts to sanitize the story. Franco's dictatorship relied heavily on U.S. military and economic support. Admitting that American weapons had contaminated Spanish farmland would have risked anti-American protests or even diplomatic rupture. As a result, Spain helped suppress external scrutiny, even silencing scientists who raised alarms. For the villagers of Palomares, this meant that the most accurate information about radiation levels never reached them. Many locals believed for years that the soil was only mildly contaminated, unaware that U.S. documents would later reveal significant radioactive remnants beneath the surface. Some farmers were told to continue working land that American scientists privately recommended should never again be plowed deeply. Others received compensation that barely covered their losses, and some were pressured into accepting settlements in exchange for silence. But while villagers struggled with the long-term consequences, U.S. intelligence agencies examined the disaster from a very different perspective. The CIA, deeply alarmed by the proximity of Soviet fishing vessels during the search, launched an assessment of Soviet underwater recovery capabilities. The agency feared that the Soviets would interpret the Palomares incident as proof that American nuclear systems were vulnerable and therefore attempt aggressive intelligence gathering near U.S. coasts or military bases. Analysts produced highly classified reports warning that the incident could embolden Soviet espionage efforts to target naval facilities, missile silos, and air bases. The worry was not that the Soviets would attack, but that they would gain insight into American warhead design or operational weaknesses. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy conducted an exhaustive review of deep-sea salvage operations. Curvy Y had succeeded, but barely. The robot's entanglement with the bomb, the broken cables, and the failed early attempts underscored how primitive underwater robotics still were. The Navy invested heavily in improving remote-operated vehicles, fearing that one day they might again be required to retrieve a nuclear weapon from the ocean floor. Only next time, it might not be near a friendly country. In the scientific world, the disaster forced an uncomfortable reassessment of nuclear weapons themselves. For years, the U.S. government had reassured the public that nuclear bombs were nearly impossible to detonate accidentally. But watching the B-28 bomb survive a catastrophic mid-air collision, fall thousands of feet, withstand intense heat, and rest underwater for months without structural failure, concerned many physicists. They saw clearly that the bomb was robust enough to survive disasters, but also fragile enough that a single miscalculation could have released a deadly cloud of plutonium over Europe. The fact that two bombs had already scattered plutonium near Palomares reinforced a troubling truth. Nuclear weapons were designed to be durable, but their explosive components remained vulnerable to uncontrolled impacts. As American testing shifted underground and public scrutiny of nuclear safety increased, U.S. scientists began incorporating multiple additional safety mechanisms into new warhead designs, many of which were quietly inspired by failure points revealed at Palomares. But outside the scientific and military spheres, Palomares took on a symbolic power that few Cold War accidents ever achieved. In villages across Spain, it became a whispered reference for government secrecy, American arrogance, and the hidden dangers of nuclear weapons. Anti-nuclear activists adopted the story as proof that the Cold War superpowers had weaponized not just their armies, but their allies' homelands as well. Even within NATO countries, politicians questioned whether allowing American bombers to fly overhead with hydrogen bombs was worth the risk, especially after U.S. officials admitted privately that they had no reliable method to prevent similar collisions in the future. But the full truth of Palomares would only emerge decades later, when declassified documents, expert interviews, and scientific surveys revealed the extent of the contamination, the seriousness of the lost bomb, and the chaotic nature of the recovery operation. These revelations shocked historians, many of whom realized that the Palomares incident had been downplayed to such an extent that the world had almost forgotten how close it came to a nuclear catastrophe. By the time the truth was widely known, the Cold War was over. Chrome Dome had been history for decades, and many of the people responsible for the incident were long dead. Yet the aftermath continued to unfold. Spain demanded additional cleanup efforts, particularly after independent investigators discovered plutonium in areas the U.S. military had never excavated. U.S. officials reluctantly agreed to consider a new cleanup deal, sparking political debates over responsibility, cost, and liability. But even as negotiations dragged on, another consequence emerged. The Palomares incident became a foundational case study in nuclear safety around the world. Military academies studied it. Nuclear scientists cited it. Intelligence analysts used it to model potential future disasters involving nuclear weapons lost at sea. It reshaped discussions about nuclear overflight policies, ultimately influencing the rules that prevented bombers from carrying live nuclear weapons during peacetime in many parts of the world. In this sense, Palomares became a turning point, not because of what happened that day, but because of what the world learned only long after the dust had settled. It revealed the hidden fragility of superpower arsenals. It exposed how political necessity often trumped public safety. And for the villagers who still live near the crash sites, it remains a reminder that the Cold War's most dangerous battles were often invisible, not fought with armies, but with radioactive particles, classified documents, and secrets buried in the soil. In many ways, the story of Palomares is not just about a lost bomb, but about the Cold War's greatest contradiction. The superpowers amassed weapons capable of obliterating humanity, then lost control of them in ways that humanity was never meant to see. By the decades that followed, the Palomares incident transformed from a tightly guarded Cold War secret into one of the most revealing windows into the fragility, recklessness, and sheer unpredictability of the nuclear age. A case study that historians, nuclear engineers, and military analysts continue to dissect because it exposes not only a moment of near catastrophe, but also an entire system built on contradictory assumptions. Assumptions that one day nearly failed catastrophically over a quiet fishing village in Spain. In the years after the crash, Spain repeatedly pushed the United States to take greater responsibility for the lingering contamination left behind by the two bombs whose high explosives had detonated on impact. Although the U.S. had removed more than 1,000 tons of radioactive soil, American scientists admitted privately that the cleanup was incomplete. Plutonium particles remained embedded in the soil, caught in rocky crevices, mixed with dust, and carried by winds across agricultural land. Some had washed into irrigation systems. Some had settled in places where American cleanup teams had never looked. As early as the late 1970s, Spanish environmental authorities began raising concerns. pointing out that radiation levels in certain areas had remained elevated for more than a decade. The Spanish people, no longer under Franco's dictatorship and therefore not forced into silence, demanded answers. But Washington, still reluctant to reopen diplomatic wounds, often responded with vague promises rather than concrete action. In 1986, the Chernobyl disaster forced a global reckoning with nuclear contamination, and the people of Palomares suddenly found their village compared to a catastrophic Soviet meltdown, even though the scale was vastly different. The comparison gave new life to demands for transparency. Spain requested updated surveys. New scientific teams arrived. Once again, they found plutonium, still dangerous, still present, still tethered to a nearly forgotten mid-air collision 20 years earlier. In the 1990s, the Cold War ended, and American journalists gained greater access to previously classified records. What they uncovered shocked the world. Internal memos revealing that U.S. officials had known from the beginning that the cleanup was insufficient. Intelligence reports acknowledging that the Soviets had monitored the search closely. Safety assessments showing that Operation Chrome Dome had been riddled with flaws that could have triggered even greater disasters. The press revived public interest in Palomares, framing it as a symbol of hidden Cold War dangers. One of the many Broken Arrow events the Pentagon had kept secret for decades. By the 2000s, environmentalists and historians began calling Palomares the forgotten nuclear disaster, arguing that the world had never fully reckoned with what happened there. Meanwhile, villagers who had once been children during the crash had grown into adults living in a community still marked by American fences, warning signs, and restricted zones. Some families reported long-term health issues they believed were tied to the contamination, though proving such claims scientifically remained challenging. American officials continued to insist that health risks were minimal, yet still refused to fully open the contaminated areas or declare them safe. Behind closed doors, the Pentagon and the U.S. Department of Energy debated whether a second cleanup operation was necessary. Satellite imaging and soil sampling confirmed what earlier surveys had shown. While the contamination was not evenly distributed, pockets of plutonium persisted beneath layers of soil that had simply been pushed aside rather than removed. The U.S. worried that reopening the cleanup would set a precedent for future claims regarding other Cold War nuclear accidents, including several that had occurred on American soil. Spain, however, wanted closure and increasingly financial compensation. In 2004, a new round of diplomatic negotiations began, culminating in a 2015 agreement in which the United States pledged to remove additional contaminated soil if Spain provided suitable disposal locations and shared some of the costs. Yet political shifts in both nations slowed progress, delaying the follow-up cleanup indefinitely. Throughout this period, the Palomares Incident became a central example in academic discussions about nuclear safety, often used to illustrate the principle that no nuclear arsenal, no matter how technologically advanced, is immune to human error, mechanical failure, or environmental unpredictability. The hydrogen bomb lost at sea, eventually recovered through a combination of luck, stubbornness, and the keen eyes of a Spanish fisherman, became the most dramatic element of the story. For nuclear engineers, it showed how robustly designed warheads could survive catastrophic accidents without detonating. For political scientists, it demonstrated how secrecy shaped Cold War crisis management. For historians, it revealed the invisible front lines of nuclear strategy, places where small villages became accidental battlegrounds between superpowers. And for the people of Palomares, it remained a reminder that the Cold War's most significant victims were often civilians who had never chosen to be part of the conflict. As the decades passed, the incident also entered popular culture. Documentaries, books, interviews, and archival releases brought Palomares into public consciousness, portraying it as a Cold War thriller involving advanced submarines, deadly weapons, political cover-ups, and last-minute rescues. Yet beneath the cinematic elements lay a simple, sobering truth. The most powerful nations on Earth had gambled with weapons capable of ending civilization, and sometimes those gambles went terribly wrong. The Palomares Incident also influenced international nuclear policy. Although the U.S. downplayed the extent of the accident, other nations took it as a warning. Several NATO countries began to restrict nuclear overflights. Safety protocols were revised. Redundant systems were added to nuclear aircraft and storage sites. And while the Cold War continued for 2 more decades, the idea of routinely flying hydrogen bombs over populated areas gradually became politically and militarily untenable. Today, Palomares stands as a place where history and radiation intersect, where olive groves grow above contaminated soil, where the crash of a B-52 bomber is still remembered by the elders who saw it fall from the sky. Memorials mark the locations where the bombs detonated. A small museum displays artifacts and photographs from the cleanup. Scientists continue to monitor radiation levels. And the fisherman, Paco Simo, the man who helped find the missing bomb, remains a local legend, his role immortalized in both Spanish memory and U.S. Navy records. Visitors are often stunned to learn how close the world came to disaster that day, how a single accident could have turned part of Spain into an exclusion zone for centuries, and how the crisis was resolved not by technology alone, but by improvisation, cooperation, and extraordinary luck. In the end, the Palomares Incident reminds us that the Cold War was not defined only by crises like the Cuban Missile Standoff, Berlin, or Vietnam, but also by countless hidden dangers. Bombs lost at sea, near misses never reported, weapons dropped from planes, missile systems nearly activated by mistake. These stories were buried for decades, overshadowed by the broader narrative of superpower rivalry. Yet each incident carried the potential to change the course of history. Palomares was one of the closest calls of all, a moment when a village became the center of the nuclear world, when superpowers held their breath, when the fate of millions rested on the outcome of a deep-sea recovery operation, and when the world discovered that, even in the absence of war, nuclear weapons could still bring us to the edge of catastrophe. As long as nuclear arsenals exist, the lessons of Palomares remain relevant, that accidents happen, that secrecy can endanger more than it protects, that technological fail-safes are only as reliable as the humans who manage them, and that even a moment's miscalculation can unleash consequences no nation can fully control. The crash of 1966 may have faded from headlines, but its radioactive echo continues to resonate through history, warning future generations about the invisible dangers that accompany humanity's most destructive inventions.